what life is about is doing things, about thinking, acting, choosing goals and pursuing them to the extent that it might be difficult or that there's pain along the way. That's might be an aspect of what's happening, but it's not central to our lives.
If you have this, this little bitterness inside you, which tells you you could be doing more, then you have to find at some point, somewhere, this willingness and this inspiration, perhaps, to push yourself a bit more to the limit.
There are limited contexts in which it's true that you'll have to overcome suffering to achieve specific kinds of values for some kinds of people, but it's not something that is central to living. It's not something that's central to achievement as such. What is the role of suffering in life? Should it be something that we seek out and strive for, or is it something to be cast aside? I'm Tristan de Liège, visiting fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. And with me is Nikos Sotirakopoulos, visiting fellow. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. And today we're going to be discussing the role of suffering in life from an objectivist perspective. In particular, we want to focus on some common mistakes that people make when thinking about what suffering means and how dealing with it relates to success and achievement. And part of the reason, Nikos, that I wanted to talk about this topic is that there are a lot of commentators that are very prominent now, especially motivational speakers, who focus a lot on self-discipline, on perseverance through pain and suffering, and who embody philosophies or self-help guides of embracing suffering and hard work and pain and fighting through it and thinking of that as really essential to living a good life. And one of the things that I've thought for a long time, and I think is worth commenting on here and why I wanted to do this podcast, is because Rand has a very interesting perspective on suffering, which we'll get to a bit later, but just to forecast it a bit, she has the view that suffering is not important. Suffering should not be central to our lives. And so there's already an interesting question of, from an objectivist perspective, how should we think about some of these more recent trends and how people think about suffering?
Good points, Tristan. So suffering in itself might indeed not be a value. And I agree with you and with Ayn Rand, it shouldn't be a value. But there is a context into which when people use the term suffering, they actually mean doing things that are difficult. And doing things that are difficult can be of value and actually is something which is of value. Courage, for example, is doing things, standing by your principles when it really matters. And this is something difficult. So often I'm more positively inclined towards the message calling people to be more open to undergoing difficult endeavors. And the interesting thing, Tristan, is that this is a very prominent debate in the culture, but lately also a debate including scientists. So even science now asks the question, could it be that getting out of your comfort zone is something which is a value in itself? Now, what does it mean, a value in itself? We'll discuss it. So here I have chosen a short clip by a neuroscientist, Andrew Huberman, where he condenses this discussion in 2 minutes in a discussion he has with David Goggins, who is the person who's become the poster boy of suffering. Now, disclaimer, we are not scientists. Maybe we're not even good to evaluate what is good and bad science on this area. But the reason I've chosen this clip is, again, because it summarizes the message that says suffering, or put differently, doing difficult things, taking difficult endeavors, could be to your benefit when you try to achieve goals that are valuable, goals that are virtuous. So let's watch this clip from the discussion between Andrew Huberman and David Goggins.
I'm going to share a little neuroscience tidbit, but I think it's one that you'll appreciate. Most people don't know this, but there's a brain structure called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. As we pointed out before, that's a noun, it's a name, it doesn't mean anything. We could call it the cookie monster.
Right.
But what's interesting about this brain area is there are now a lot of data in humans, not some mouse study, showing that when people do something they don't want to do, like add 3 hours of exercise per day or per week, or when people who are trying to diet and lose weight resist eating something.
Right.
When people do anything that they, and this is the important part, that they don't want to do.
Right.
It's not about adding more work, it's about adding more work that you don't want to do.
Yes.
This brain area gets bigger.
Yep.
Now, here's what's especially interesting about this brain area to me. And by the way, I'm only learning this recently because it's new data, but there's a lot of it. The anterior mid-cingulate cortex is smaller in obese people. It gets bigger when they diet. It's larger in athletes. It's especially large or grows larger in people that see themselves as challenged and overcome some challenge.
Right.
And in people that live a very long time, this area keeps its size. In many ways, scientists are starting to think of the anterior mid-cingulate cortex not just as one of the seats of willpower,
Right.
but perhaps actually the seat of the will to live.
Yep.
And all the data point to the fact that we can build this area up,
Yep.
but that as quickly as we build it up, if we don't continue to invest in things that are hard for us, that we don't want to do, that's the part that feels so Goggin-esque to me, that we don't want to do. Like if you love the ice bath, yeah, I love the ice bath, and you go from 1 minute to 10 minutes, guess what? Your anterior mid-cingulate cortex did not grow.
None.
But if you hate the cold water, if you're afraid of drowning and you get into water and put your head under, then your anterior mid and survive, then the anterior mid-cingulate cortex gets bigger. But if you don't do it the next day, or if you do it the next day and you enjoy it, because hey, I did it yesterday, woohoo, happy me, Merry Christmas, as you would say.
Merry Christmas.
Guess what? The anterior mid-cingulate cortex shrinks again.
Yep.
To me, this is one of the most important discoveries that neuroscience has ever made, because it's that I don't want to do something, but do it anyway.
That's right.
That grows this area. And it's almost like I have a friend, he's been sober 30 years from alcohol. And he always says, you know, the amazing thing about addiction is there's a cure. The problem is it only works one day at a time.
Yep.
So this is the context, Tristan. The context is that through doing difficult things, you become good in life, so to speak. Through doing things that are unpleasant, but be very careful here, unpleasant but healthy, or unpleasant but towards achieving some goal which is a pro-life goal, let's say, such as becoming more fit, becoming stronger, becoming more flexible, becoming better educated. When you do things that you wouldn't expect you would be able to do, things that push you out of your comfort zone, then you become better at pursuing any value, any other thing in life which you might want to pursue. You become better at value pursuing, so to speak.
Yeah, so David Goggins is someone that in particular I thought was worth thinking about as a case study. And
sorry to interrupt you. David Goggins is the guy to which Andrew Huberman is talking about.
Yes, and David Goggins is a very interesting person. He's an incredibly inspiring story of someone who, you know, started from a very low point in his life. He was overweight and depressed in a job that he hated. And then he sort of completely turned his life around and became an incredible athlete, became extremely ambitious, joined the Navy SEALs and so on. And part of the reason I want to use him as a case study, even though he's not a philosopher, he's mainly an athlete, but he's very popular and he has a lot of things to say about this way of thinking. His book, Can't Hurt Me in particular, it's sort of a memoir about his life, but it says a lot about how we should think about suffering and pain, and that most people don't think about it the right way, and most people value comfort too highly. And because he's so prominent, I thought that was one reason that we should focus on him.
Indeed, we are not using it as a positive necessarily example when it comes to how he thinks about suffering, but we're definitely using him as an example of someone who endures a lot of difficulties towards changing himself. So let me say a few things about about Goggins. I've read his books. I've followed his work, and I'm one of the people who have found inspiration getting out of their comfort zones just by reading his story. So what's his story? So as you said, a child from an abusive house till his early 20s, he's at a very as low a level as it can be. Obese, a job that he hates, and it's not just obese. He feels disgust with himself. He looks himself in the mirror and he does not like the person he sees. He does not like his character. He does not like that he has not achieved the things in life that he thought he could be able to achieve if he had another character. So the book, in a way, is a story of a character building. And then, as it often happens, at the lowest of his low moments, and a day when he has returned from a shift where he sprays for cockroaches, he catches on TV an episode about the Navy SEALs. The Navy SEALs is a special force in the US Navy, and as Goggins sees it, at that point, the human equivalent of the hardest, sharpest sword you could imagine. So the Navy SEALs were everything he was not. They were determined, physically fit, they were disciplined, and they were achieving impressive endeavors. And actually, when Goggins watches the documentary focuses on the Hell Week, which is some days, a continuous process of 5 days and 5 nights of the most grueling drills that are testing one's physical and mental strength. And Goggins reacts to this spectacle. He sees it and something wakes up in him. And he gets this crazy idea that he could be one of these men. He could also be a man of excellence. But to become such a man of excellence, for him at that point in his life, it looks like an impossible task. Remember, he's barely literate, he's way overweight for the standards of the army, not to mention the Navy SEALs, and in simple terms, to achieve something important in life, he would have to go through fire. More specifically, he would have to lose 106 pounds in 3 months. This is 48 kilos in 3 months. And again, the point here is not someone to read and say, I'm going to lose 48 kilos in 3 months. The point is, again, the realization that to achieve an important value, I will have to do something difficult. Something that will require me to be a different person from the person I've been till now in my life. And actually, he did it. And then he gets to the SEALs team, but that's just the beginning of the path. Because to accomplish his dream and to become a Navy SEAL, he would have to go through 3 hell weeks. And then he would have to go through the most demanding military training in the world. And during this training, he has pneumonia, he has injuries, and yet he goes through. Why? Because the goal is worth it. So this is not suffering for the sake of it. This is suffering to achieve something very important. And after that, as you say, he does more impressive endeavors. Now, here's an important lesson that he took from this story and how he conceptualizes it. He says, when I do these difficult things, it's like I'm building calluses on my mind. You know, when you do pull-ups, you get calluses in your hands. It means your hands become harder. They can take more difficult tasks. And the same happens, he says, with the mind. Every time you go through something difficult, you become harder and more capable of facing the next difficulty. And Tristan, I see this as an exercise in building self-esteem. Because what is self-esteem at the end of the day? It's your knowledge that, first of all, you are worthy of living a good life. So you view yourself in the mirror and you like what you see. But also self-esteem means you are capable of living a good life. I've heard it somewhere, it's and I think Rand also mentioned it's something like this. The reputation you have with yourself. And what a better way to build this quote reputation in yourself, rather than proving to yourself time and again that you can do the difficult things you have to do in order to achieve your goals. So to finish, Goggins created a concept to capture this character building process, this self-esteem building process. He called it the cookie jar. You know, the jar where people put cookies. And he said, every time you achieve something difficult, every time you achieve an important endeavor, it's like you put a cookie in this jar. And then in tough times, during difficult challenges, you go back to the cookie jar and you fuel yourself. You find the inspiration and the confidence that, and the pride that you have done difficult things in the past. And the achievements of the past, the difficult achievements of the past, inspire you to achieve new victories, to pursue new values. Values that now might be even more difficult, right? Again, I take this from objectives. They're like life is a spiral. Every time we aspire to something more and more and more. And there's a good chance this more and more and more might be something more difficult. So at the end of the day, here's the message I get from David Goggins. Great endeavors require effort and sometimes pain, physical pain. Imagine trying to run a marathon, but it's not pain for its own sake. It is pain as a means to an end. And I will just read you my favorite line from the book. It's from the first book, Can't Hurt Me. It's page 161. He says, he talks about his training in the Navy SEALs. It showed me what the human mind is capable of and how to harness it to take more pain that I've ever felt before, so I could learn to achieve things I never even knew were possible. So that's why I like this message, Tristan. It's about achievement. It's about achieving important things. Now, for different people, it's something else. You might say, what's the point of finishing the Navy SEALs? Or someone else might say, what's the point of running a marathon? Or someone else might say, what's the point of becoming an expert in a philosophy? Yet, if these values are carefully and properly chosen, odds are they will require difficult effort. And I like this message of undergoing difficult endeavors to achieve values.
Yeah, so that's all. Thanks for that context, Nikos. And it's his life is no doubt so extremely inspiring. And I think when you put it in a value context, I think it starts to make more sense. And I think when we're actually like looking at how he actually lives his life, for the most part, it seems like a life that would be endorsed by Objectivism. That's, you know, and I don't know him personally, but that, you know, his level of perseverance and ambition is extraordinary. And so that can't be discounted at all. But in terms of like thinking about suffering and then some of the things that he says in the book, one of the things that I thought was worth discussing here and bringing up is this question of like, what is suffering and how do we conceptualize it? And I think this is something that people often make a mistake about, because there's a difference between pain and suffering, and there's a difference between discomfort and suffering. Suffering is a prolonged experience of painful emotions, owing to a difficult circumstance or to a prolonged physical or psychological illness or condition. And when we're thinking about how do you push yourself to, out of your comfort zone, how do you push yourself to pursue values that are ambitious? How do you choose a life where you realize your full potential? Because those are all things that are very live for the objectivist philosophy, and from Rand's perspective is how do you do that? Your life is up to you, and the point of living your life is to reach your full potential. But it's not to reach your full potential of overcoming suffering. It's not to reach your full potential of maximizing your pain threshold. It's not to reach your full potential of what's the most difficult thing you could possibly do. it's not to reach your full potential of how hardened can you become against pain and suffering and failure. The focus is always on the positive, and you notice, for example, for people who have read Atlas Shrugged, there are really interesting lines and quotes from John Gall and some of the other characters as well, when they talk about pain or suffering. And John Gall in particular, there's a line where he says, suffering is not important. And it's not that I don't suffer, but it's that I know that suffering is not important. It's to be fought and cast aside. And the idea is, in a rational life, you shouldn't, first of all, if things are going well, you shouldn't be experiencing a lot of suffering. If there is suffering, it's unfortunate, and to the extent that you're rational, it's due to things that are outside of your control. You're not causing your own suffering. But more than that, what life is about doing things, about thinking, acting, choosing goals and pursuing them. And a lot of times that, first of all, that doesn't require suffering a lot of the time. And what's important about that isn't to the extent that it might be difficult or that there's pain along the way. That's might be an aspect of what's happening. And it's true that if you're very ambitious, a side effect of being ambitious is that you will sometimes suffer, and life does involve suffering normally, because we become attached to people and things, and we lose things, and we get illnesses, and people we love have illnesses. But it's not central to our lives in the way that I think is sometimes suggested in Goggins' book. So Goggins will say things like, schedule suffering into your day. And he describes himself as someone who loves suffering. And he quotes from the Buddha, who says that life is suffering. And he says, I know what the Buddha means. Like, that makes sense. But from the objectivist perspective, there's a misconceptualization, I think, here of, on the one hand, thinking of things like discomfort and pushing past your own boundaries, and on the other, a prolonged experience of painful emotions, which is not good and should not, be sought out or celebrated, really. And the thing is that it's in the context, and I think with a lot of the motivational speakers that are similar to Goggins, people like Jocko Willink, or other people that are involved in the military, when you focus more on the physical examples or the physical metaphors, it makes more sense. Because, for example, if you're running an ultra marathon, and you know that you want to finish it, your body is going to send you signals of pain to you at a certain point, because what you're doing is so beyond the bounds of what the body was evolved to do. And that's part of what it is to run. And it's well known that, in cycling and running, that people experience that kind of thing. But I think it's a misconceptualization to think that those kind of examples, or the examples of people that need to be really hardened against pain just in order to be able to do their jobs, like Navy SEALs, that you can sort of extend that to how you live life in general. And that, like in any field, whether, you're an architect or you're writing a book, well, you're going to suffer a lot and you're going to have to push through that suffering. I don't think that's really the right way to think about it, even though in a limited sense, it does sort of make sense that when you're thinking about something like running a marathon or pushing through a very difficult military training, that you would think about that. But there are a lot of other things that are much more central to, like, realizing difficult values that don't involve suffering and don't require suffering in that way. And there are plenty of people who obviously are very successful that haven't gone through the amount of suffering that Goggins has gone through. People like Steve Jobs, who had actually a pretty comfortable life before he started Apple, and that you can have that level of perseverance and willingness to step outside your comfort zones, surely, but it doesn't have to go with suffering in the sense of prolonged emotional or physical pain. But it's true that Goggins did go through a lot of that, partly because of, as you said, his circumstances were so difficult. And so I think that's part of the lesson, is how do we conceptualize suffering? There are limited contexts in which it's true that you'll have to overcome suffering to achieve specific kinds of values for some kinds of people, but it's not something that is central to living. It's not something that's central to achievement as such.
There's not a single thing in which you said with which I would disagree. Yet I would just want to add one more thing. Again, why I'm slightly more positively attuned to Goggins' message. And this is that for every one person out there that comes across Goggins' messages and gets the wrong idea that suffering is an end in itself, or we should positively seek out suffering, there are a million people, and I would include myself in these people, who either live their lives that are unfulfilling, or, and that's me, the next category, who live lives that they know they could be doing more. I know I could be doing more, for example, in my intellectual development. I could be a better writer. I could be a better speaker. I could be better in front of the camera. But I also know that in order to do these things, I would have to do things that currently I'm not doing. I would have to wake up earlier. I would have to be more disciplined. I would maybe have to do with other values. For example, should I spend so much time, I don't know, watching football or whatever? And these are difficult decisions. This is not suffering, but this is something which requires a lot of discipline and willpower. So in that way, I view someone like Goggins and Jocko Willink, by the way, because you mentioned someone else who is a great role model for me. Although, obviously, again, these people are not philosophers. And these people, I would say, they don't even want to be any kind of gurus. They give you a personal, they give you a personal example, and they inspire something to you. So this is why I view these great achievers and the people who have gone through difficult things almost as a piece of great art. Because what does great art do? A great art is a reminder. It tells you that, this is what is possible. This is what is possible for a human being. And this is what you could be capable of. You could be doing more, actually. You could be more. This is the example I get. So when I see Goggins, for example, breaking a record in pull-ups, I don't want to break a world record in pull-ups. But I'm thinking, if a human being can achieve this through going all this difficult, I mean, if you read the book, he went through burns in his hands, and it was very gruesome trying to break a world record in pull-ups. But then you can think, how does it translate to my field? And you said Steve Jobs didn't struggle or suffer. He went through, though, very, very, very difficult things. It's not easy being Steve Jobs. And actually, I would say not everyone has to be Steve Jobs. But if you have this, this little bitterness inside you, which tells you you could be doing more, then you have to find at some point, somewhere, this willingness and this inspiration, perhaps, to push yourself a bit more to the limit. And I consider myself also very lucky that I came across to Goggins after I had come across Objectivism. So I was already in Objectivism when I came across this message. But you are very right. There is a possibility that someone can read it and come with this duty-bound, almost Kantian notion that if you do something that you enjoy, it's bad, and only if you do things that suck is good for you. But again, remember, always here. Why do you go through all these difficult things? To achieve something on the other side, which is good, something which is a value, and which is a value that you have chosen. If you want to run a marathon or an ultra marathon because Goggins ran a marathon, but otherwise marathon means nothing to you, or your knee is destroyed, then it's not a good idea. But if you want to do it for a reason which is yours, you have deeply thought about it, and you figure out that it's something which is worth it, then yes, what a great inspiration such figures are.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say about all of that, and in particular, I think you're right that part of what is positive about it is that people often do sell themselves short.
Yeah.
And Goggins does focus on that a lot. And it's true that a lot of people don't realize what they're capable of because they settle for comfort. They settle for what's easy. I think from the objectivist perspective, and so maybe we can segue to a little bit more about that. The thing that's relevant for choosing values and thinking about how you're pursuing values is what's your purpose? What's your overall goal? Like, why are you doing it? And how are you thinking about it? Like, why is it valuable? Like, why are you choosing that thing? So there's like, why do you want it? And then like, what is the thing? And why are you choosing it? And the reason to choose values, and the reason to pursue values is neither because they're too easy or too comfortable. Goggins is right that like people should not choose lives because they're comfortable. People should not choose lives because they're easy, or choose a career because it's easy or comfortable. But nor should you choose it because it's difficult. Nor should you choose an activity or a goal or a career because it's demanding, because it's difficult, because it's painful. And I know many people who are very ambitious that have had to rationally sort of restrain themselves and step back from careers that were too demanding because they lost the joy in it. And it lacked some of the other values that they wanted in their life. And the harder path would have been to continue with that job. So I have a friend who's a lawyer who had to do that. Her job was too demanding. I think she was working 70-hour weeks. And I think this is exactly the kind of situation that I think you could be confused about if you read Goggins the wrong way, or if you take him the way I read him, at least, depending on whether we think like he would agree with this, which is that if you're holding like embracing suffering and overcoming suffering as sort of your standard of how you should be doing, then you're going to think that you're selling yourself short if you're enjoying yourself too much, if you love what you're doing and it comes to you easily and you don't feel like you're suffering. You're going to think, oh, I need to push myself more. But on the other hand, if the way you conceptualize your valuing is not in terms of how much suffering or how much comfort is there, that might be an aspect of it. But if it's more along the lines of, what am I capable of, and what's the kind of life that's most valuable to me? What will bring me the most joy? What will make me feel the most alive? What will be the fullest use of my mind? That's a different kind of question. Because that kind of question, when you answer it, may not be the kind of life or career path or goals that are the most difficult or involve the most suffering. And sometimes it involves, scaling back from that. And so just to sum up here, I think part of the objectivist perspective is that what's really important in life is purpose. Like, what you're doing and why you're doing it. And from the objectivist perspective, your rational overall purpose, your rational ultimate purpose is your own happiness. And so at the end of the day, you can you can have overcome all kinds of suffering and endured through all kinds of pain and have an extremely calloused mind. But if you haven't achieved happiness at the end of that, it's pointless from the objectivist perspective. And there's a view I think you can have that at least some of these authors are more towards that view. I think people like Ryan Holiday who are more philosophical would say, like happiness is not that important, or at least it's not important in the way that people think it is. But from the objectivist point of view, that's what life is about. It's about joy. It's about enjoying your life, and not just in a superficial sense, but in the sense of knowing that what you're doing is valuable. Using your mind to its fullest capacity, but it's not necessarily going to involve like the greatest overcoming of suffering or the greatest overcoming of pain to live that kind of life.
And Tristan, earlier I mentioned that I view such figures like Goggins in some way as I view art, as an inspiration. And what you said just brought to my mind the greatest inspiration I get from art, from actual art, which is the Fountainhead and Howard Rourke. Remember the interesting dichotomy, or what someone would see as a dichotomy in Rourke. On the one hand, how much enjoyment he gets from his work. There is that line where his sassy friend Mike tells him, "Hey, come on, like it's so obvious that you're so in love with your buildings. Like, don't be so happy. It's indecent." He says this with love, metaphorically. But at the same time, this is the same Rourke who travels later in the book from the one town to the other because he has many projects. He barely sleeps. Again, obviously, people, the message here is not don't sleep. I'm just saying. Or we see him sleeping on the floor in Cameron's office with a coffee spilled beside him because he's been working for consecutive nights. Again, later in the book, we see him working on consecutive nights. But is he suffering? No, he's not suffering. But he's going through difficult endeavors. He's going through he's achieving difficult things. He has discipline. He has willpower. Even physically difficult things. And yet at the same time, he loves his work. He loves his life. So I want to emphasize what you just said. Very, very good point. Quote, suffering does not have to mean, how to put it, existential suffering. It's always towards a life that you want to make better. And what is this beautiful line that Ayn Rand has? Morality, the goal of morality is to teach you not how to suffer and how to die, but how to be happy and how to live.
Yeah, that's a great quote to end on, Nikos. Yeah, thank you. And there's a lot more we could say about this, of course, but I think just as a starting point, we already mentioned Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. Those are obviously things that we would recommend for thinking more about this, just in the sense that those some of the main characters who are heroic go through very difficult circumstances, but don't really suffer in quite the way that you would think. And then there are also some other resources that we'd recommend to look at in relation to this topic. And obviously the book itself, Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins, it's a great read. We highly recommend it. His stories are incredible.
And when we say we, Tristan, me and you, and again, making it clear because people, it might not be clear where we're discussing as it's not that objectivism is recommended. It's like me and you as students of objectivism read that book and we took some good messages and we enjoyed it, and that's
yes.
Like more like that
yes.
goes without saying.
Yeah, the philosophical content is not endorsed here.
Yeah.
And the article by Ben Bayer, who's also a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, Don't Resign Yourself to Suffering, Combat It. And finally, another thing by Ben Bayer that he did with Greg Salmieri, which was a podcast on the new ideal called should we accept suffering as part of life? And they did that during the pandemic, and they primarily engaged with a lot of religious perspectives in that podcast. So it's a somewhat different contrast than we were talking about here, but I would also recommend it.
Can I finish with a line from the other book of Goggins, which is his second book, Never Finished? I just want to, because we talked about Ayn Rand, and Ayn Rand has this idea that we are beings of self-made soul, that we create our character. But the world out there is so full of determinism. The world out there keeps telling us, stand in your line. You are an avatar of your identity. You're something static. And how much I like that actually Goggins says. He says that discipline can almost change your DNA. And he says, discipline does not have a belief system. It transcends class, color, and gender. Discipline is the great equalizer. Nowadays, it doesn't matter where you are from or who you are. If you're disciplined, there will be no stopping you. So again, I take this message as you are the builder of your character. It's like your life is a statue, and as I've read somewhere, you're like the sculpture, but at the same time, you are the stone. You can create yourself, and obviously, it's not easy. Obviously, it's we are struggling ourselves with doing this. But what a nice vision it is, and how healthier it is from the poison that tells you that your identity, or you couldn't help it, or you were born this way, or your life is predetermined by factors that have nothing to do with your will, with your free will. We're beings of free will. We are efficacious beings. We can change who we are within the context of obviously what is biologically possible. And I want to say a big thank you, Tristan, for picking this topic. I really, really enjoyed this podcast with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Nikos, for joining me. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and click the bell to get notifications for when we go live or post new recordings. If you're watching the recording, please like, comment on, or share the episode, which helps us attract new viewers. And consider doing the same if you're watching on Facebook. If you do have questions or comments about today's episode, or you have suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all of your emails and reply to many of them. Thank you.